Hey everyone, welcome to Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast. This podcast is all about farmers markets. Whether you're a farmers market manager or a small farmer, food maker, or artisan selling at farmers markets, you have found just the right podcast.
I'm Kat Fields-White.
And I'm Bridget Myers. We're longtime farmers market managers, educators, and consultants. Get ready to catch up on all things farmers market pros with us. Today we're talking with Wendy Chen of the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School, home of the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit, about their new resource all about volunteers.
Today's episode of Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast, is supported by MarketWorks, providing a single, multifaceted tool to manage your markets, schedule your farmers and vendors, create market maps, and maintain up-to-date data on attendance, space rent, sales, and more. Give up that stuffed 3-ring binder and free up your time. Click the MarketWorks logo on the resource page at farmersmarketpros.com to get started today.
Well, welcome back to Tent Talk, everybody. Today we are joined by Wendy Chen from Vermont Law and Graduate School. Wendy's talk at this year's Intense conference about how labor laws come into play at farmers markets generated a lot of conversation among all attendees.
Still going on in the private
sure.
group. Yes. Don't you remember when Wendy said?
There's a new resource in the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit specifically about volunteers, and she's here to explain why that is so important. Welcome to Tent Talk, Wendy.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to join you.
We are so happy to speak with you today. You are a wealth of information. But first, maybe just for our listeners who maybe weren't at the conference or don't know you, could you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up involved with the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems?
Sure. So I started off my career in New York, actually doing some sort of local policy work, and then went to law school. I thought I would continue doing sort of policy, legislative type stuff, but ended up practicing employment law, representing mostly workers in discrimination, wage and hour claims for about 10 years in Seattle. Decided to make a change because I was a little burnt out on litigation and moved to Vermont. I ended up working at the Vermont Department of Labor, ultimately as an administrative law judge. And one of the things I did decide was occasionally misclassification cases. So usually when an employer misclassified an employee as an independent contractor, it doesn't come up as often when folks are like misclassified as volunteers. It's usually independent contractors when it comes before the Department of Labor. I did that for several years and then decided to make a change after the pandemic. I worked on a farm for a year, and that's how I sort of got more interested in food and farm issues. And after a few months after I stopped working at the farm, I just saw this opening at Vermont Law and Graduate School Center for Ag and Food Systems, and it was like an amazing, perfect combination of law, policy, and food and ag. So I've been here now as a legal fellow about a year and a half.
What did you do on the farm?
I was a greenhouse assistant, so I did a lot of watering. I did a lot of planting and seeding and caring for tomatoes and cucumbers. And awesome. I did some work in the wash house and on the fields and that kind of thing too. I also helped it with the farm store. Yeah.
Oh, I love awesome. On site. Do you have were they at farmers markets at all? Did you work at a farmers market or shop at a farmers market, or where's your connection there?
Yeah, I did not work at a farmers market. They don't do summer farmers markets. Some years they've done winter's farmers market. But I have shopped at farmers markets for a long time. First of all, in Seattle. I mean, they've got a pretty good sort of farmers market community in Seattle. The Ballard one is sort of a flagship one, and that one's great. There was also my sort of more local West Seattle one, which got bigger over the years as Seattle did in general. And then I moved out here, and we've got a lot of very local ones. There's the bigger one near me is Brattleboro, but there's a Putney one and a Greater Falls one, and I think it may have stopped operating actually, but near the school, there was the one in South Royalton too.
Oh, nice.
That one I have not been to though.
Nice. Ballard's actually one of our favorites.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
relatives in Seattle and in Ballard specifically, and we love that market.
Yeah.
Yeah. So many great markets out there. That's awesome. You're in a nice market area.
Yeah.
So how much of your time is devoted to the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit with your work there?
So it's a little hard to quantify, and it tends to kind of happen in fits and starts rather than just sort of constant. But I would say probably about a quarter of my time. Some of the other projects I work on right now are on farm to school policy. We're doing some work on prison food. And I also am doing some work on catch shares, which is a fishery management program or a type of fishery management program that has resulted in some sort of corporate consolidation and equity issues that we're looking at. And all those projects, we work with various project partners, other organizations, and partner with them because they kind of know the issues and what's really happening more than we do. And we provide policy and legal research and support.
Wow.
So the Farmers Market Toolkit actually was in partnership with Farmers Market Coalition, right?
Yes, Farmers Market Coalition, as well as the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont. So we have sort of that local audience covered, as well as something from a more national perspective.
Nice.
And then, so it was developed with FMC. And then how did Vermont Law School decide that farmers markets were a segment that needed and deserved support? It sounds like there's a lot of work with agriculture, but then do you know how that kind of pivoted over to focusing on farmers markets for this toolkit and other kind of programs that they help with?
Yeah, so it started before I joined, of course. So I was not around then, but the Center for Ag and Food Systems, CAFS, we work across the food system. So not just agriculture, but sometimes like farmland access, which even sometimes land access affects farmers markets as well. Things about urban agriculture, like farm to school policy, farm to corrections policies, community land trusts. So it sort of runs the gamut. With the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit, my understanding is that it was at a NOFA Vermont conference when our former director, I believe, kind of started talking to somebody from NOFA Vermont. And she was saying, we're getting all these questions from our markets about like business structure, accepting SNAP, other issues, and there's no legal resource out there. And that's sort of how it started with this conversation. And then FMC was brought in. And because farmers markets are such an important part of like particularly local and regional food systems and access, as well as supporting farmers, it sort of was really consistent with the type of work we do.
Yeah, it's been such a great resource. Maybe for some of our listeners that aren't familiar or have not heard of it, can you maybe just explain like the toolkit, just briefly, like what that is and what that provides?
Absolutely. So the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit, it's farmersmarketlegaltoolkit.org. Again, as you mentioned, we started it in partnership with the Farmers Market Coalition and FM and NOFA Vermont. And it was really to help market managers and operators throughout the U.S. with some open source legal tools that would help inform the market managers mostly and operators as they were trying to make decisions to build and grow their markets. So the general topics that were selected for inclusion in the toolkit were really the questions we got most. Recurring questions from market managers about how their business structure would affect their organizations, about what types of legal risks markets face and how to management, so risk management procedures and tools, as well as how to make their products available and accessible to their communities by accepting SNAP and EBT. The FMLT, as we also call it, the site was launched in 2018, and over the years, although a lot of the substance hasn't changed because the laws haven't changed so much, as we've heard recurring new questions that have come up for markets, we have added some resources. During the pandemic in particular, there were lots of questions coming up about face masks and whether, that would run afoul of some disability accommodation and disability discrimination issues, and also sort of what free speech rules markets could implement. And that was during the time of some, political activities, as well as sort of the masking issue.
Some
Tactfully phrased.
vocal friends at the market.
We were there.
Yeah.
It was exciting.
So it sounds like it doesn't really change much since it's based on laws, and the laws are, around and not changing very frequently. Is this, so we're going to talk about the volunteers at the farmers market and managing the legal risks with that. Is that kind of the first new module since the introduction of a legal toolkit? Or is that, I know you said some pandemic specific items were added, but is this kind of the newest or the first new module that was added to it? Or is it revised regularly?
Yeah. So I would say it's not generally revised. Certainly if we hear about something that, wasn't clear, because people will contact us directly through the website. There's an inquiry form, or we just hear things that aren't clear or misleading, or there's a gap somewhere very specific. We'll address that and make corrections. Or if we know some law has changed, we'll certainly try to make those corrections, and also try to keep the links active, because probably broken links are the biggest thing we continuously update. And then we have added a few new, more additional content, like the free speech resource, the ADA resource. And then the two most recent ones were about employment classification in terms of independent contractor versus employee for farmers market managers. And then the most recent resource is similar, but it goes over the laws and rules around using volunteers and not misclassifying volunteers as volunteers versus employees.
Yeah.
So those two were sort of done not quite simultaneously, but kind of in the same project year we tried to do.
Yeah. So related for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the volunteers at farmers markets managing legal risks, that whole guide is really embedded in the established Farmers Market Legal Toolkit, right? It's not a separate thing.
Not really, no. So we've been trying to have, any new content both be, available as a standalone PDF as well as integrated into the site. So the content, there always has been a section on employment and labor law, compliance risks, and risk management. And these two resources go into much more detail.
Great. Yeah. And I think it's a huge topic. As we were saying, after you were at the Intense conference, we have heard on a regular basis, we have a very active private Facebook group of market managers and market participants. And every once in a while, somebody will ask something about volunteers or about their own classification as a manager. And somebody will say, don't you remember what Wendy said? Ask yourselves these questions.
You gave us a good framework, I think. Not really, not technically legal advice, of course, but a good framework, and always to keep top of mind, to keep these questions in mind so that we don't, as operators, don't run into situations where we've classified someone incorrectly. So it's very helpful. Yeah.
So why were volunteers chosen as a concentration? Is there any current data on how many markets use volunteers or even managed entirely by volunteers? I know there's a copy of the 2019 USDA survey in the new volunteer toolkit. Is that the most current information we all have, or is there additional research?
There may well be some, state-specific research, but nationally, this is the most recent I'm aware of. I do know the USDA folks are working on a new survey of market managers. I'm not sure how long it will take to get out. This was released in 2020, and the data is based on 2019.
So that's 5 years ago, and I just wonder.
Yeah.
For one thing, I think farmers market managers have become a little bit more professional. Mm-hmm. Thanks to the conference and many other things and Farmers Market Coalition's efforts and things. So I wonder if there's a little bit more awareness, and if maybe that USDA survey shows a really large number of markets being managed by volunteers. And so I wonder if that's changed at all. So some of the things to watch for when including volunteers on market teams, obviously employment classification is part of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, as Bridget mentioned, all of the information in the resources on the toolkit and what we'll talk about today is meant to be educational, not specific legal advice. And if there are sort of really detailed questions the farmers market has, I would really recommend talking to an attorney who's licensed in that state for very specific circumstances.
Yeah, and so often the
yeah.
states will add things to the federal guidelines
Yes.
too, right? So it's very different. We in California, for instance, tend to deal with employment laws that's kind of a see ya and raise you 10, feds.
We're so lucky. They love us.
Yes. Yep. And I actually just heard, I think it's the city of Seattle has now basically applied all the employment protections to independent contractors. So things do tend to be very state and sometimes city specific. So, and most of what we talk about is sort of generally federal law or common state laws.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Does the organizational structure of the market affect the legal issues around using volunteers?
Yes. The big difference is whether you're a for-profit organization or a nonprofit or government organization. Nonprofits and government organizations can use volunteers lawfully. There are restrictions on how they're used and how they're treated, but under the law, they can use volunteers. The law says if you are for profit, whether you actually make a profit or not, whether you have good intention, whether you kind of think of yourself as a, community group, if your business structure is a for-profit structure, legally you cannot use volunteers under federal law.
Got it. So that's pretty across the board, I think. On the other side, there seems to be a perception, I don't know if you call it a rumor or just what people seem to think is that if you're a 501c3, you got a free pass when it comes to using volunteers, but it's actually more subtle than that, right?
Yes. I mean, as an initial matter, yes, you in some way, shape, or form, as a 501c3, you are entitled to use volunteers. But there's still restrictions because there's a definition in the law of a volunteer, and that's someone who performs hours of service for civic, charitable, or humanitarian reasons. So that would cover you being kind of a 501c3 or a nonprofit. But it also has to be without the promise, expectation, or receipt of compensation. So that's one really important thing. It can't be just a, sub-minimum wage employee that you call a volunteer. It really has to be done out of humanitarian, charitable reasons without expecting or receiving any compensation.
So, Wendy, would that include things like giving volunteers gift cards, market money, things that they can spend at the market?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be cash money or a check or a direct deposit. It can be anything of value. You can give. So not allowing compensation doesn't mean if you give somebody 1 penny or like a free, one-time fruit basket or something like that, that takes them out of being a volunteer, because a nominal fee is allowed, as are like expense reimbursements. So that nobody's actually paying to volunteer. For nominal fees, there's not really a definition in the law, a clear definition of what that means. But the more it is, the more likely it's going to be looking like compensation. There's some guidance that says I think anything more than around 20% of what you would pay an employee to do this work would be definitely more than, not what's considered a nominal fee. There's another law called the Volunteer Protection Act, which only protects volunteers against certain liability, not the farmers markets or the organization. But that says a volunteer can only get protection if they don't receive $500 or more in a year. So anything worth 500 plus takes them out of that law. It's not the same law as the sort of classification laws, but it gives some sort of guidelines.
Got it. Okay, those are good tips. A little bit of guidelines to go by. Are there limits to the tasks that a volunteer can perform versus what a paid employee does?
Again, yes, but it's sort of
that's kind of
again not like bright line rules. What I think the government tends to look for is that you are not using a volunteer in place of an employee, really displacing an employee and saying, well, we can avoid costs and administrative burdens by just calling someone a volunteer, even if we pay them something. And so the government sort of also looks at, what does a volunteer typically do? Volunteers typically don't work full time and do like the absolute essentials of the organization, because if the organization is relying on that so much to operate, it's hard to say like it's just a volunteer who could, come and go as they please. So oftentimes they'll look at, is it, it's more likely to be a volunteer if it's part-time and not a full-time thing, if they're not doing like the core ongoing work of the organization, and they're doing things that you typically would just associate with volunteer work. In terms of farmers markets, I think most of what seems pretty clear in terms of task-wise is like somebody who volunteers just on market day to help a little bit, or, comes once a month and helps with some specific task, or, and this is probably outdated, but like comes in like stuffs envelopes for a mailing, a one-time thing.
Maybe or takes a survey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's harder. And it's a closer question if it's actually a market manager who works very regular hours as a market manager, which doesn't mean you cannot, you absolutely can't have a market manager. But if they're working, 40 hours a week managing the market, it's hard to see how they could do that on a volunteer basis.
Yeah, and a lot of paid employees only work on market day. So is there a lot in this that's about, I know when you get into independent contractors, one of the big questions is, do you tell people where and when to do their work? Does that also apply to volunteers? Obviously, if you want to volunteer on market day, you're telling them where to be and when to be there.
Yeah. The law really doesn't consider in general, how you manage or supervise a volunteer. It's about the compensation, the business structure, and kind of the type of work they do and how really important it is to the organization as well.
I think this is going to
So
help a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. So, our business is structured for profit, so we pay all of our employees and things. But I know I talked to a lot of farmers market managers. They're running the whole market and they are volunteers. So, yeah, they need to probably take a look at that and see if there's a government agency or a nonprofit agency that they're partnering with that's using them as a volunteer. And even if they're willing and able to do that, think about the legalities of that. So talking about that, what are the risks of not looking carefully at how this market, like your market team members are classified? Like, is this a federal issue or a state issue or both when it comes down to like the real nitty gritty legality of it?
Yeah, most likely it's both the federal and state issue, because certainly under the federal law, there's basically a requirement that you pay all employees a minimum wage. And under state laws too, normally for employees, you have to pay into the unemployment trust fund and pay for workers' comp. So if folks are treated as volunteers and they're not paid those things or given those benefits, that could violate both federal and state laws.
Yeah.
And, I can't really advise on, what a specific market has to do, but, it's a risk. I'm not going to say like, if you have one volunteer in your for-profit, you're clearly going to get slammed by the government, that kind of thing. I think, some things are riskier than others, but you always potentially run the risk of somebody who's a volunteer who maybe does a lot of work, gets unhappy and says, I should have been paid for this work.
Yeah.
And then they could complain to a federal agency or a state agency and then make a claim for the wages and benefits and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So this is more like an individual who has been doing this work that would bring it to the attention of an agency and not really something that groups are getting audited for randomly. Like, is there something that happens where agency can come in and say, okay, who's working for you and how are they classified? Or does that not typically happen?
I would say that does not typically happen. And I have not heard of farmers markets being, an enforcement priority.
Yeah.
Most of these things are complaint driven.
Yeah.
And that's how the enforcement works. There are certainly some cities and industries that are subject to more scrutiny, like, the Uber and Lyft, those types of things, where industries are kind of known for these issues. There might be some enforcement and proactive enforcement.
Yeah.
I will say it probably is more to do with the independent contractor versus employee distinction than volunteers versus employees.
Yeah. Just best to have a good structure set up and be aware of what the rules and regulations are just from the get-go so that there's not, and checking in with these folks regularly just to make sure that these complaints aren't coming up. We've certainly seen this sometimes, not very often, and actually not very lately with vendors, employees, like individual contractors that work with them at the market, or their actual employees, or maybe on a volunteer basis, having a complaint situation. So yeah, just good to check on that before that happens for sure.
Yeah.
And then what are some other kind of things that market organizations can do to kind of cross the T's and dot the I's in terms of liability when it comes to this kind of thing?
Yeah. So what I would say is, if putting aside sort of the employment classification and wage type issues, I mean, there's an insurance issue. So normally, like if your employee is working for your organization and they get hurt on the job, workers' compensation covers that. They're not going to be able to sue you as the employer for getting hurt on the job under most circumstances. And then they'll have some wage replacement and medical bills paid for through workers' comp. If they're a volunteer and they don't have workers' comp and they get injured, potentially they could sue you for their injuries. And that may or may not be covered by a commercial general liability insurance, depending on, the actual policy. So I'd say look at your insurance and talk to your insurance agent about how to protect your market if you're using volunteers.
I'm just going to say most insurance agents are going to go, don't do that.
Yeah, they're going to say, don't have employees.
Well, I think most policies, our insurance policy certainly has very specific information in there about anybody that's working on site has to be covered by workers' comp.
Yeah.
So I would imagine, just knowing insurance guys, I just think they're generally not going to love the idea of volunteers.
Yeah.
Just as a rule.
Because that's an uncovered person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or you might have to pay a little bit more to cover against any injuries that your volunteers may suffer, or that they, not intentionally, obviously, but cause, like in case they, they're setting things up, and how they set things up, somebody trips on something, like a vendor, who's responsible? And you just want, as the market, you want to make sure your insurance covers that. Yeah. And I will say, like, for the volunteers, I think volunteers sometimes don't think about it either, is that if I'm volunteering and I'm not an employee where my employer's insurance and all that's going to cover it, do I have liability? And that's one of the reasons, or at least the fear was one of the reasons that there's the Federal Volunteer Protection Act, which basically says, with limits, if you're volunteering and cause some sort of injury or illness or whatever through negligence, you can't be sued. I'm oversimplifying it a lot because there are restrictions to that. But that's also one of the reasons, like as a market, you should be kind of checking on what tasks your volunteers are doing and doing some screening. Because, for example, a volunteer would not be covered if they were, say, driving a motor vehicle. If they injure someone driving a motor vehicle as a volunteer, there could still be some liability. Or if it's something like they're doing plumbing for the market for some reason, and they're not actually a licensed plumber, there could be liability. So there's some, limitations on that. And the Volunteer Protection Act does not provide any protection to the organization, just the volunteer.
Do you suggest, or have you seen people using volunteer waiver kind of documents?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would I would say those are not always foolproof. And you want to make sure they're pretty tailored to whatever activities and tasks the volunteer is doing, not just there's a risk of, life is risky.
Right.
So if anything happens while you're volunteering, you're not going to sue us. So it would kind of, you'd want to like point out what the hazards might be in that situation. And yes, have like indemnification, hold harmless, or liability waivers is not a bad idea.
Great.
It's a great idea.
So much to think about.
So much to cry ourselves to sleep about at night. Just kidding. I mean, we have to talk about this stuff. And we always say this at the conference whenever we have someone speak about employment, legalities, and insurance, and all of these things that are not the most fun parts of our job. But it's really important, and it's really vital to making sure that we're covered as organizations that operate farmers markets, because if we don't do this work and then something happens and our businesses go under, it affects more than just our own business and our own employees, because we're responsible for all of these farmers and small businesses that are a part of our market. And so we really need to take this very seriously so that our market can continue to operate and do it in a safe and legal manner. So it is, we laugh because it's scary, but it's important to talk about and to really get solid information from somebody, like you said, Wendy, like speak to an attorney that's really familiar with the regulations in your state as well, so that you just really make sure that you're covering everything. And a lot of us do. I mean, we have a whole HR department and we have policies and coverages for our staff and so an insurance up the yin yang, but it's for the benefit of the market, and it helps me sleep at night for sure. So
it's important to bring this up, though, because I think especially a lot of smaller markets and rural markets and things, they haven't thought about this.
Yeah, exactly.
Farmers markets are happy places that are often put together with a lot of volunteer effort.
Yeah.
In their organization, if not their day-to-day. And I think sometimes we don't think about all the things that are required to make sure we're doing it right and are protected from all the liability out there.
Yeah, it's just the way the world is right now. So, it serves a purpose too, because it protects people. I mean, this came about because people they're being taken advantage of and not being protected. So
yeah, and if anything, nothing else, at least you kind of know what your risks are, even if you can't eliminate them all. Maybe you can't afford every bit of insurance. Then liability waivers can help at least mitigate the risk a little bit. One thing I did neglect to mention in response to a question you had, Kat, about the task is there is one type of work that volunteers, even for nonprofits, shouldn't engage in, and that's any commercial activities. So the typical example would be like a nonprofit museum. You can have volunteers there, but you can't have volunteers working in the gift shop that is like basically almost like a for-profit gift shop.
Oh.
Because that's they look at that as not exploiting the volunteers, but sort of unfair competition. If one store doesn't have to pay employees and can use volunteers and is competing with other businesses that have to pay their employees, it's considered sort of unfair competition.
See, now I think this is huge and a distinction that a lot of market operators probably aren't making, that if you've got a volunteer who oftentimes is assigned to help in the info booth and answer shopper questions, that same person at many markets is selling shopping bags or T-shirts. And so that would be something that you'd have to look at really closely.
Yeah. Didn't think about that.
And that's why we pay our employees.
And that's why
we're scared.
Yeah.
We're scared.
Yeah. Or, I mean, like, what needs to be done in your market. I mean, maybe it's just a matter of you are a small market. Yes, all these helping hands help and you can do all these extra things, but really if it's not a legal situation, what needs to be done? And how can you pay people to do those tasks and then really use the volunteers for, like you said, kind of some extra helpful one-off things?
Just segregate that job description.
Yeah,
between volunteers and paid. Wendy, did we miss anything? What else should we have asked you? What's going to get us in trouble that we didn't even know was out there?
So I will just say, like, more detail, probably in a clear manner than I've laid out today, is in the resource that's on the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit.org resources section. There's one on volunteers that we've been talking about today, and there's one also about independent contractor classification, as well as, just the more general stuff.
Yeah, we'll make sure and put those links in the show notes too, so that people can easily get to the volunteer module.
And I really, hesitate to say this even because it's all kind of scary enough, but I don't want to say worst case scenario, but it is possible the way that some of these laws are written in certain states and somewhat under federal law, that there could be individual liability. So not if you misclassify someone and don't pay them wages, it could be the market itself. That organization could, have some liability to pay unpaid wages, that kind of thing. But if, for example, the owner of the market, if it's a like sole proprietor or something, well, they would have individual liability anyway because there's no corporate structure. So that's a bad example. But let's say it's an LLC and it's one of the owners of the LLC who's the one who decided, they're the ones who decide you're a volunteer, we're not going to pay you anything, etc. That person could face some individual liability. So the market doesn't have enough to pay, but first, somehow the owner is very wealthy, the individual worker could potentially recover from them. Mm-hmm. So it's just good to know. And directors and officers liability insurance generally does not cover that.
Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those deep pockets, that's what they're coming for, right?
Oh, boy.
Oh, my. Or not even really deep pockets, but who in this situation owns assets? Who has a house is the kind of thing. So, yeah, it's all scary stuff, but we just got to be aware and be on guard about that. Wendy, will the Legal Toolkit continue to add kind of specialized resources? What else is coming up at the center? What are you studying?
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, right now we are working on actually reviewing the SNAP EBT section, and the laws have not changed and regulations have not changed that much. Some of the ways, FNS does things have changed, which is hard for us to address in a legal toolkit when it's not sort of written guidance, but we are reviewing that to make sure it's all up to date. We're actually having a third-party consulting company, do an evaluation of the site because we want to make sure it is accessible and useful for a really broad range of markets, particularly, some of the newer types of markets that are BIPOC-centered, really serve BIPOC communities, have even maybe like a social justice component to them. So we just want to make sure we're not missing anything because we work really closely with FMC and NOFA Vermont, and they're connected to a lot of markets. And we also, talk to folks as well, but we just want to make sure we're not missing anything and that it's a comprehensive resource that meets a lot of different markets' needs. Trying to think what else we may be working on. So that evaluation, it may be, result in some changes, but not necessarily a ton of new content. One of the things we've also talked about, which we're not sure because this resource was really meant to support like market operators and managers, but vendors are so important for markets resilience and operations that we are having some discussions about, whether it makes sense to provide a little bit more legal information for vendors as well.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And we have actually heard, questions and have been sort of asked about that. And we think the evaluation might inform that. Yeah. And often operators are the same people as the vendors too.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. There are market operators that are also farmers or vendors at that market as well. But
I think this would be huge to maybe look specifically at what might be added for farmers and vendors. But also, I think as market operators, it would behoove us to get this link to our farmers and vendors because things like employee classification and volunteers and some of the other things that are in the toolkit, even though they're sort of designed for market operators, they're actually very relevant to people operating businesses at the markets.
Yeah.
And so the toolkit, even as it exists now, in a lot of sections could be handy for our farmers and vendors. We should spread that word.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So
yeah, we would love folks to take a look at it and also let us know if there's things that legal issues that are concerned to you that the toolkit doesn't address and maybe could.
Yeah. Yeah, we appreciate it.
What a great resource. And just thank you so much for all the work that you've done on this. I know it's very complex and us market managers are just love being so compliant about things and offering information. So I'm sure it's a little tough sometimes, but really appreciate you. And that toolkit is such a great resource. And so I really encourage all market operators to go take a look at that if you haven't, and just regularly review it, with your team, or if it's just you, just take a look and make sure that, you're not missing anything. So thanks so much, Wendy.
That's right.
We really enjoyed speaking with you today on Tent Talk. And thanks so much for being part of the conversation.
Thank you.
All right. Shoppers and even many farmers market participants don't realize everything it takes to make markets safe, legal, and financially sustainable for everyone involved. Without organizations like the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School, the National Farmers Market Coalition, and, if we do say so ourselves, Farmers Market Pros, it would be even tougher. We're happy to share ways that you can make your life easier by taking full advantage of all the toolkits and tips that are out there to limit your liability, reduce your stress, and make your farmers market enterprise more successful.
Thank you for listening today, and thanks to MarketWorks for supporting managers with a multifaceted tool to manage your markets and collect and maintain that up-to-date data on attendance, sales, and more. You can do it easily inside the MarketWorks program. And thanks to them for supporting Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast. Click the MarketWorks logo on the resource page at farmersmarketpros.com to get started today.
Thanks for listening to Tent Talk today. Please leave us a review on your podcast app or wherever you listen to Tent Talk. Let us and others know how you're enjoying the podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of Tent Talk. Connect with fellow farmers market folks in our private Facebook group, the Farmers Market Pros Community, and follow us on Instagram at Farmers Market Pros. Find online education and other resources at farmersmarketpros.com. Tent Talk is brought to you by Farmers Market Pros, where passion meets profit. Tent Talk is hosted by Kat Fields White and Bridget Myers and produced by Leandra Hayes, with original music by David Mead. Tune in next week for another great episode.